Doctors instructed Andrea Bocelli to terminate her pregnancy, but her absolute refusal set the stage for an empire. You assume massive global success stems from careful planning, elite cultivation, and generations of specialized training. Andrea Bocelli's timeline starts with sheer, terrifying survival. At just a few months old, screaming in clinical wards, medicine offered zero relief from the mounting pressure expanding inside his skull. Then, inside a quiet Tuscan home, a phonograph needle dropped. High-fidelity opera arias flooded the space, and the infant instantly went completely silent. Most adults cannot decipher complex Italian librettos. A baby utilized those soaring vocal frequencies as a narcotic. That reaction obliterates the myth of casual talent. Music didn't function as a hobby. It operated as an essential biological anchor long before he could even comprehend language. The family watched an infant essentially medicate himself with sound. You cannot teach a child that kind of visceral dependency. It erupts. The crying stopped because the acoustic vibrations physically altered his distress signals, rewiring his neurological panic into sustained calm. The pain wasn't a random anomaly. It was a biological sniper shot centuries in the making. You picture illness as an external invader, violently breaching the body's defenses. Congenital glaucoma behaves like a sleeper agent. It traveled seamlessly through generations of the Bocelli bloodline without raising a single alarm. Men and women worked the sun-drenched Tuscan fields with absolute visual clarity. They never knew they harbored defective copies of the CYP1B1 or LTBP2 genes. Autosomal recessive conditions demand a precise, devastating arithmetic. Both parents must carry the exact same silent mutation, remaining perfectly asymptomatic only to pass the loaded weapon forward. Each child produced by two carriers faces a ruthless 25% chance of inheriting both altered copies. When Eddie and Alessandro's genetic lines intersected, the microscopic drainage canals in Andrea's developing eyes completely failed to form. Fluid trapped inside the ocular cavity multiplied. Pressure crushed the delicate optic nerve while he was still suspended in the womb. By the time he opened his eyes to the light, the destruction was already active and irreversible. The defect wasn't a punishment. It was a devastating mathematical certainty born from silent carriers colliding. Only one out of every 10,000 to 20,000 children draws this horrific biological lottery ticket. He retained a fragile 10% of his vision in a single eye. We romanticize partial blindness as a mercy. It actually functions as a psychological torture device. He possessed just enough sight to recognize the geometry of a piano keyboard, the vast stretches of the family farm, and the distinct features of his mother's face, while simultaneously knowing it was actively eroding. If total blindness arrives at birth, the brain builds an entirely different spatial map. Here, the map began with sight, and then slowly disintegrated. The system completely collapsed 12 years later. A stray soccer ball struck his head during a match. The fragile optic infrastructure shattered instantly, plunging him into absolute permanent darkness. Society categorizes the event as a tragic athletic accident. Biology recognizes it as the final execution of a genetic code written before the Italian Renaissance. Total blindness forces a horrific psychological adaptation upon a 12-year-old boy. Every visual memory instantly became a permanent, degrading archive. The brain, violently deprived of its primary sensory input, aggressively rerouted immense processing power into his auditory cortex. Sound didn't just comfort him anymore, it completely replaced sight. His ancestors endured a completely different kind of darkness. You imagine historical European farmers enjoying pastoral freedom on rolling, picturesque hills. The Mezzadria system legally enslaved them through perpetual contracts. 7 consecutive generations of Bocellis poured their sweat into the Spedoletto farm. The dirt beneath their boots belonged exclusively to aristocratic dynasties like the Corsini princes, who controlled vast estates dating back to the 17th century. These noblemen provided the bricks for the houses, the tools for the harvest, and the seeds for the dirt. In exchange, they demanded a relentless, inescapable bloodletting. 50% of everything. They didn't take a margin. They took half the grain, half the wine, half the olives, year after agonizing year. Leaving the estate meant immediate homelessness and certain starvation. The system perfectly balanced survival against subjugation, guaranteeing the family possessed just enough calories to work tomorrow, but never enough capital to escape. A century of watching predators confiscate your harvest fundamentally alters a family's psychological framework. Ambition rots. Dependence becomes the only religion. The Mezzadria system intentionally engineered a mindset where security demanded absolute compliance, and any attempt at upward mobility threatened the immediate survival of your children. The Corsini overseers didn't simply control the agricultural output, they governed the very concept of possibility. Gasparo Bocelli committed agricultural heresy in 1831. He did not beg the Corsini lords for a larger percentage. He utilized hoarded, hidden savings to outright purchase his own tract of earth. The acquisition of Pogioncino violently severed a chain of indentured servitude that had choked his lineage for decades. Bound agricultural laborers transformed into sovereign landholders overnight. Purchasing property sounds completely mundane today. For a 19th century sharecropper, it equated to a geopolitical revolution. Yet trauma does not automatically vaporize upon signing a deed. The hypervigilance of extreme poverty deeply infected their decision-making. They expanded the vineyards with agonizingly slow precision over the next century, terrified that one reckless investment would hurl them back into the grip of the nobility. They chose belonging over escape, remaining anchored to the exact same Lajatico region that once functioned as their outdoor prison. The soil that previously represented their subjugation suddenly represented their sovereignty. That paradox anchored the Bocelli identity. They built a localized legacy, pouring decades of sweat into expanding the vines and selling farm machinery, completely unaware that their greatest export would eventually be invisible. Out of this ruthlessly practical, dirt-stained history emerged an impossible frequency. You desperately want to trace global genius back to a prominent musical grandfather. He does not exist. No professional musicians populated the Bocelli ancestry. Farm machinery sales and viticulture sustained their reality. Yet Edie treated her home like a concert hall, continuously spinning operatic vinyl. That ambient exposure collided with an inexplicably profound, innate aptitude. Andrea bypassed formal instruction entirely, aggressively teaching himself the piano at 6 years old. Then came the flute and the saxophone, demonstrating a mind-absorbing musical logic faster than the average child. By age 7, while peers struggled to read basic sentences, he accurately identified the microscopic vocal nuances of legendary tenors like Franco Corelli. A child analyzing pitch control defies standard developmental models. This wasn't a cute parlor trick. He was downloading the architectural blueprints of grand opera directly into his nervous system. He taught his fingers to navigate the piano keys without the aid of sight, mapping the instrument through spatial memory and absolute sonic resonance. The absence of vision amplified the intensity of his auditory focus, allowing him to isolate and replicate vocal techniques that typically require decades of rigorous conservatory training to master. Rural environments routinely assassinate artistic deviations. Hard labor demands immediate practical utility. Eddie built a fortress around the anomaly. While medical authorities had previously recommended erasing his existence, she loudly proclaimed him her miracle baby. Her staggering defiance insulated his development. She did not possess the technical vocabulary to train him, but she granted the ultimate psychological permission to expand. Blindness accelerated the takeover. Stripped of visual input, his brain aggressively rewired its sensory hierarchy, transforming music from mere expression into his primary navigation system. The vocal cords expanded, the lung capacity deepened. He sang tirelessly in local piano bars, simultaneously grinding through law school just to guarantee a stable income. Belting out standards to distracted patrons, sipping cocktails could easily have been the permanent ceiling of his career. The world is filled with staggering talent, decomposing in dive bars. He operated as a defense attorney for a brief period, wearing the suit, arguing the cases, conforming to the brutal practicality his ancestors would have demanded. The breakthrough required an outrageous statistical anomaly. Elite talent frequently rots in isolation because access remains blocked by gatekeepers. In 1992, a raw demo tape featuring his voice accidentally intercepted the orbit of Italian rock phenomenon Zucchero. Zucchero passed the recording directly to Luciano Pavarotti. The global matrix snapped open. When he finally stepped onto international stages, performing for popes and massive crowds, audiences wept. They incorrectly assumed they were experiencing a sudden magical revelation. They were actually absorbing the explosive culmination of centuries of agrarian suffering, immense maternal stubbornness, and blind survival instinct concentrated into a single resonant frequency. The family that once surrendered 50% of their grain to princes now converted their ancestral farm into the Teatro del Silencio. This massive cultural amphitheater draws global crowds to the exact soil that previously bound them. The stage literally rests on the coordinates of their historical captivity. Logic dictates the mutation should end there. Greatness rarely replicates sequentially. Andrea Bocelli remained completely invisible for 2 decades. You would bet your life that a world-famous tenor immediately forced his son into rigorous vocal training from the cradle. Andrea possessed zero knowledge that his son could even hold a tune at first. Matteo kept his mouth firmly shut, singing exclusively in private, discovered by his mother instead of introduced by his father. That isolation operated as a crucial incubator. Constant external pressure warps developing talent. Unmonitored immersion allowed Matteo to absorb the atmospheric logic of opera passively, internalizing breath control and emotional restraint without the paralyzing fear of failure. He studied the mechanics of the voice without realizing he was in a masterclass. The Tuscan air inside that specific household acted as a silent conservatory, shaping his pharyngeal resonance and lung expansion long before he ever consciously decided to step up to a microphone. The 2018 premiere of the duet Fall on Me on the album C dismantled every skeptical assumption. The public braced for a mediocre nepotism project. They encountered terrifying continuity. Matteo did not merely mimic the phrasing. His actual physical instrument mirrored the biological architecture of the maestro. You cannot fake the density of a vocal cord, the hidden genetic combination that spent centuries lurking in sharecroppers had successfully copied itself. Yet he wielded it differently. he bent the classical foundation toward contemporary pop on solo projects like the album Falling in Love, evolving the inheritance rather than freezing it in carbonite. The legacy mutated to survive. Matteo utilized the ancestral endurance required to harvest grapes to survive the grueling repetitions of vocal tracking. The combination of a world-class genetic instrument, an unpressured immersive environment, and deeply ingrained agricultural discipline formed an unstoppable triad. Remove a single element, and the voice evaporates back into the Tuscan hills. This sequence violently attacks your understanding of your own body. You look in the mirror and believe you represent a finished, complete biological product. You don't. You operate as a walking storage facility for unactivated codes. Generations of your ancestors endured famines, crossed oceans, and survived plagues, accumulating massive genetic data files that currently sit dormant inside your cells. You assume that if you possessed a hidden talent, it would have proudly announced itself by now. The Bocelli anomaly proves that profound capabilities will quietly hibernate for hundreds of years, waiting exclusively for the precise environmental trigger to unlock them. If an elite operatic frequency can camouflage itself inside a lineage of impoverished dirt farmers until the invention of the phonograph, your assumptions about your own limitations are mathematically flawed. What massive, unrealized capacity is sleeping inside your DNA right now, quietly waiting for a collision that hasn't happened yet?